Welcome to Economics Applied, a podcast sponsored by the Hoover Institute. My name is Stephen Davis, host of the show. Our guest today is Elias Papaioannou. Elias is professor of economics at the London Business School and academic director of the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development. He is also the joint managing editor of the Review of Economic Studies, one of the most important scholarly journals in the economics profession. What I most appreciate about Elias is the highly imaginative character of his research about major issues in political economy, economic history, economic development, and finance. Welcome, Elias. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for your very kind invitation.
So you co-authored an article in 2022 for the Journal of Economic Literature on the political economy of populism. And that's the topic I want to discuss with you today. So to get us rolling, give us your preferred definition of populism.
Thank you, Steve. Let me say that this is joint work with Sergei Guriev, who not only is an amazing political economist himself, but he's also a fighter for democracy in his native country, Russia. So we started working with Sergei on this issue going back in the early 2010s, both of us based in Europe, and seeing at the time that the European crisis was going handy with a spur of conspiracy theories, of people embracing extreme views that they were not going mainstream at the time. Which brings me to your question. There have been many definitions of populism. And our profession, economics, used to employ a definition by Rudy Dornbush, the great MIT economist, and Sebastian Edwards, who defined populism as, in some sense, inappropriate macroeconomic management, inflation, effectively having a very strong focus in Latin America. Nonetheless, if one looks at populism in the 2010s, when Sergei and I, in the recent research in economics, kind of resurfaced, although you still had a couple of political parties and politicians very much inspired or following, if you like, the traditional Latin American populism, you had also vintages of populism that you could not very easily kind of square. So our preferred definition comes from an American political scientist, Cass Mood, which defines populism as a thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated by two very antagonistic groups, very far apart, but very homogeneous within. The pure people and the corrupt elite. So what Sergei and I found extremely interesting from this definition, first is that it's not economics. It doesn't speak much about GDP, inflation, redistribution. Secondly, it is broad enough so we can think of various phenomena, for example, Bolsonaro, to pick one example from Latin America, Chavez, another one, thinking about neo-fascist parties in Europe, blend them together. And what we further find very interesting is that all of us differ. We have different opinions, different ideology, different backgrounds. Society is very diverse. And actually, I think what populists have been very good at, populist parties and politicians, is trying to take very heterogeneous societies and split them into the corrupt elite, which generally enough, sometimes it will include media, it will include perhaps oligarchs, the very rich, sometimes people like us, Stephen, like academics, even scientists. This would differ from case to case, and then the pure people. And what is further interesting, given our interest in institutions, is that although this definition does not have an anti-institutions explicit in it, effectively it is, because if you start saying that the elites, let's say people working at LBS or at Stanford, are the elites, and all the others are kind of the pure people, effectively you imply a strong anti-institutions agenda.
Okay, so thank you for that. And couple of things, but first let me note that our next scheduled guest is Sergei. So he's coming soon. So if you like Elias, tune in next time for Sergei. A couple of things about your definition. So you emphasized a corrupt elite, but I guess at least in the US context, it's also about perceived incompetence and arrogance, I think. And maybe that's, if you have an inclusive notion of corrupt, it doesn't just mean for personal monetary gain. It can mean something more than that. Like we think we're better than you are, and we're going to tell you how to live your life. Is that part of your definition?
It is neither part of our definition nor of other definitions that have been put forward. Now,
Okay.
let me move on your question and say every country is actually idiosyncratic by itself. And I would say even a place like the United States is very heterogeneous. So what the various definitions of populism are trying to do is take various distinct phenomena in various parts of the world and try to put them under an umbrella, which obviously will not be very satisfactory.
Right.
So, for example, two other political economists, political scientists in the US, Norris and Inglehart, define authoritarian populism as a philosophy and style of governance that typically has a very aggressive rhetoric against establishments, which often has overriding minority rights, overriding constitutional checks and balances, explicit anti-institutions, and at the same time blending this with xenophobia, nationalism. But again, what we thought a lot about this issue. We thought, let's take a very broad definition that where we could fit various heterogeneous and very diverse phenomena.
Yeah, okay, so that makes sense. But the other one thing two more things about what you said. The idea it's a thin ideology. I think that rings true. That captures something important about the way populism manifests itself in many countries. But you didn't mention explicitly in your original definition, or you just did now, another feature that seems to arise in many countries, which is that there's a nationalist element to populist movements. And sometimes that nationalist element takes the form of we're great, we're better than other places, or we're unique, but sometimes it takes an uglier form, some kind of xenophobia. Is that you're not counting that as necessarily populist, or am I misunderstanding?
Well, I would say that the definition of Norris and Inglehart will be explicitly also mentioning xenophobia, racism, and a fear towards others. I would say that the minimum common denominator that we employ would put those as the others. So those others, could be refugees, could be migrants. So this would be the case, for example, in Marine Le Pen case, or even some fascist parties in Italy. Perhaps it has an analogy with the MAGA movement in the US. But clearly, xenophobia features prominently among the rise of populism in the past 15 years, but not exclusively. Let me say we have many instances, I would say, of populist parties coming mostly from the left, where xenophobia does not feature prominently.
Okay, so we've got a working definition on the table. It's a broad umbrella, as you described. If we're going to make some progress on understanding this phenomenon and assessing its effects in a systematic way, we need to quantify it somehow. At least that's my view. You can tell me if you differ. So how do you go about quantifying the scale, the intensity, the character of populism so that you can subject it to a systematic inquiry? How do you do that?
That's a great question. And actually, this was also our starting point. Let me start saying that the political science literature and some of our colleagues in economics, when they were studying specific events, they would say, for example, Trump, to give one example, could be coined a populist, or the five-star movement in Italy and the Lega Nord are the populist parties. So let's do a quantitative exploration of the drivers of the support, let's say, for Trump or for the two populist parties in Italy. So a lot of the evidence, even a recent paper at the American Economic Review by Funkes, Mularek, and Tresvest, take this narrative approach. Let's go to political science. Let's see what people tend to believe across some phenomena, and let's come up with a definition. Obviously, this classification can always be questioned by you, by me, I presume by everybody who would be listening to this podcast. So one approach is to come up with some strict definition, at least that's how I think about it, where you would see parties that are xenophobic, that are anti-immigrant, for example, anti-refugee, they have an explicit anti-institutional agenda, and then start kind of taking more and more broader definitions. And of course, where you want to draw the line is based on your taste or perhaps my taste. Another approach, which is becoming more and more popular, is taking kind of a speech approach. So with advances now in machine learning, we can scrap the politician speeches. The manifesto project collects not only speeches, but also party platforms, and see, for example, how prominently, racism, to give one example, features in the ideology of the party or the speeches. At some point, some researchers do that. If I'm not mistaken, Maduro and Chavez would get like the gold medal on being like the most kind of populist. If I'm not mistaken, Tony Blair and Angela Merkel would be like the least populist. The nice thing of this definition, I think we can always quarrel on the specificities, but I think it makes a point that all politicians, or many politicians, we elect politicians to express what individuals, what the citizens believe. So this actually makes it quite interesting, because you should expect, in some sense, the politician to also reflect what the community that voted for him or her reflects. So what I think is interesting from this more continuum, if I was to say, kind of definition, is that they illustrate this feature that is prominent in politics, it's prominent in democracy. I think we want to keep that. And then allow us, at some point to draw a line.
Okay, but let me just break that down a bit. So you can look at the speech of politicians or political leaders. You can look at them in their entirety, say everything that gets into it covered by a newspaper in a country, or you can look at the political speech of the people who actually win elections. So that presumably will give you a different answer. And I guess you're endorsing both of these approaches.
Yes, and actually what we did with Sergey Yanalgan and Evgenia Pasari for a paper at Brookings, where we look at the drivers of populism in Europe, there we relied on the Manifesto project, so on political scientists, who collect the manifestos of parties, that I think bypasses this issue that perhaps the newspapers might report more, let's say, a speech with some element of racism vis-a-vis some other speech that does not have this component. And political scientists, the whole idea of this project, that they meticulously go over the manifestos, perhaps they also go to some speeches, and they come up with a classification of whether a party is populist or not, whether it's nationalistic, and whether it has an agenda that is very much what they coin as the radical left or the nationalistic right. Again, there is always some debate where exactly one draws the line, but let me say that all of these various approaches kind of yield similar kind of results, at least on the driving forces and the implications.
Okay, so I'm going to summarize what I've understood so far. So the early economics literature on populism essentially identified a set of policies, macroeconomic policies in particular, that was associated with populism. You and the literature, as I understand, has moved in a very different direction towards looking not at policy per se, but what political leaders, politicians say in their speech. And then we can distinguish between the entirety of political speech that meets some criteria versus what is said by political leaders in control.
True, with one twist, if you allow me. The work of Dornbusch and Edwards, they have like a great collection of essays on Latin American populism. Well, effectively, when they say that Perón is a populist, or Vargas is a populist, or I don't know, even Allende, perhaps he was classified as a populist, still it's based on the speeches and what he was telling at the time. Perhaps they were not doing machine learning, but it's
right. But what you haven't said so far is what's revealed by survey or other evidence directly about what the electorate think, okay, which is a different source of information. Is that not used as an approach here? And if so, why not?
So surveys, the analysis of surveys go back both in our profession and in political science, but now we have the capacity to run bigger kind of surveys. So one does observe in surveys, for example, the polarization in America, that you had like more voters kind of identifying. There was a question on whether you would self-identify in a 0 to 10 a left-right kind of scale. You see more and more people, like, self-identifying with something on the far left, on the far right. The data we tabulated with Jan, Evgenia, and Sergey kind of point to the similar picture in Europe. And what is interesting, which illustrates back your spot-on point on heterogeneity, is that, for example, in Northern Europe, what we saw in the 2010s, let's say the crisis decade in Europe, that in the North, this movement of voters went mostly to parties that sprang from the nationalistic right, while in the South, in Greece, for example, or in Spain initially with Podemos, or in Italy with the Five-Star Movement, it mostly was coming from parties that sprang or had traced their origins in communism or, the far kind of left. Which I think illustrates this power that, people are being polarized themselves, and perhaps the politicians, which I think is the way we think about in economics, kind of, try to position themselves close to the electorate.
Okay, so you've already transitioned to what I was going to ask you about next, which is there are various ways we can measure populism as you've defined it. None of them are perfect. They're all subject to questioning, so let's just stipulate that. But it's still quite useful, I think, and I gather you agree, that we want to try to quantify this phenomena as best we can. So when we do that, give us your broad overview of what you think we now know about the most recent wave of populism, which I date back to roughly the global financial crisis, but maybe you have a different dating in mind. So kind of tell us, what do we know about this recent wave of populism, date it as you wish, and just kind of summarize the main findings in that respect.
Yes, so let me take your viewpoint, because this was also my personal interest. I lived that, although I was working at the time in the US and then in the UK, in my own country, Greece, and in Europe more generally. So let me focus in the more recent period. Clearly, we could go later, if you like, to Perón and the Latin American vintage, or the fascist movement, or if you like, to go even further back to the Popular Party or the People's Party in the US. Now, what I think we know relatively well is the following. What are the driving forces, both of voting for extremist parties, either of the far left or the far right, originating and with a very strong populist agenda? Now, if we were to think about economics, I think we have very compelling evidence that economic shocks, either kind more secular, like trade globalization and automation to a lesser extent, or more related to the crisis, such as the big economic downturn in the world or in the US in 2007-9, in Europe, of course, and in the South, it was way bigger and much longer. Right. We know that all of those three features, so major economic downturns, one, trade globalization, two, and to a lesser extent, automation, have been, promoting giving to the populists actually ammunition, if you like, to pursue their agenda. There is very exciting research looking in the US that the popularity not only of Trump, but of politicians who come from the extremes of the Democratic Party and the extremes of the Republican Party did well in places where the US manufacturing used to be based, where you had like a significant loss of jobs, especially 2000, 2007. There are kind of similar evidence looking at the automation shock, both in the US and across the world, and also following my work with Evgenia, Sergey, and Jan in Europe. Clearly, you see that in those regions in Europe where the crisis was the deepest and the most severe, it lasted longer. In those parties, the success of Syriza, of Podemos, of the Five-Star Movement, of the AfD party was significantly high. And interestingly, you find similar dynamics in the UK during Brexit, which I think to me is the apogee, the pinnacle, if you prefer, of populism, because this was a policy with very lasting consequences. You do see clearly, if one tabulates data across 550 or so electoral presence in the UK, that in places where the changes in unemployment, or if you like, the decline in manufacturing were the largest, 2008, up until the Brexit referendum, in those places, the voters went heavily and voted for Brexit. So first part, economic shocks do matter. We have compelling evidence. I don't want to go to the details of identification, quite credible, given how large, especially those shocks. Relatedly, and I think this goes to your previous question, this vote for populist parties goes handy with much more extremist attitudes. So in our work, as I mentioned before at Brookings, we find that not only people vote for the populist parties, but if one tabulates the European social surveys, you do see that they become more to the extreme. They believe which is actually quite relevant, I think, also for both of us, that they do not trust the judicial system, they do not trust the democracy, they do not trust the courts. If the only actually, in the case of Europe, institution that gets more support from the rise of populism is the police.
Okay. Okay.
So people become kind of more, if you like, scared.
So I want to know if do you have a view? I guess the two-part question. The democratic institutions in a representative democracy can be designed in a whole variety of ways, and they can be more or less responsive to transitory or minority impulses in the electorate. So in a parliamentary system, you can have minimum threshold requirements before there's any representation at all of a particular political party in the parliament. In the US style setting, many people have argued that the design of our primary system actually encourages, at least can encourage in some circumstances, the strengthening of fringes, because the right fringe might dominate in one party's primary elections, and the other party's primary elections might be dominated by the left fringe. Okay, so at least I just want to get your sense of this. At least in principle, it's possible to design a democratic system in a way that's more or less insulated from populist impulses. So first, does that matter much in practice when you look across, say, representative democratic countries that you've looked at? And two, if it does matter, is it something that we should actively promote as a way to moderate the impact of populist political movements on democratic outcomes?
Great questions. I'm not sure I will have a very good answer. Let me say on your first part of the question, we see the surge of populist parties and politicians across both presidential and parliamentary systems, which brings me to the earlier remark, there is demand for it. People are afraid of automation. They have been hit by globalization. Let me say globalization to an economist is always a good thing. On average, I just lectured at the London Business School on China. The remarkable success of China is a facet of that. I think it's fair to say that the political system, perhaps also our profession, didn't pay much attention to the kind of the left behind, if you like, of globalization. So on the first part, I think we see a big demand for people for kind of populist parties, and I would say political entrepreneurs, I like this word, although I not necessarily like the people, have been quite cunning in taming to this demand. Now, the second part is how we can think about institutions. To me, and given my strong belief and research that institutions do matter, it allows our differences to be settled, to converge, are being seriously challenged. And I think this was the part that the mainstream parties did not fully get in the beginning. And I'm not speaking only in the US, I speak here kind of globally. Now, on the moderation, here come some interesting observations. And by no means I don't want to be sound as positive on those individuals. Marine Le Pen has moved her party vis-a-vis her parent, vis-a-vis her father. So I think we can always...
Say that again, I didn't catch that.
So I'm just saying that many populist parties, once in power or once close to power, they kind of move. And let me further say that mainstream parties that you and I would not classify as populist, would kind of endorse some populist agenda or in some policy, or some politician who seems pretty good from the other party, they would bring him in. We have like ample of evidence of that. So which actually makes the classification even harder, because how do you classify a party that historically was not populist, but now starts becoming a bit populist? Or how would you classify, I think it's fair to say, that the party of Marine Le Pen is different than the party of her father.
Right.
Or I was reading my great colleague Lucrezia Racklin writing at Project Syndicate saying that, look, perhaps Giorgia Meloni has not ruled the way most people thought ex ante. Which actually brings me to the last point, that some people would argue, try to engage And I think a lesson, it touches also my personal view, is that I think it went also to your earlier point, we should not be cocky as a profession, as individuals, because we work at Stanford or at LBS. So I think the more we engage with the people who are worried about globalization, who are worried about automation, and not because I want to stop automation per se, I think it's something that we should be encouraging both our students and our students. I mean, those who are more applied.
Okay, so I'm going to draw an inference from that, and you can tell me if it's not the one you intended, which is there are advantages to slowing down the speed with which populist impulses become integrated into policy decisions and policy leaderships. And partly because it gives the mainstream parties, at least if they're doing their job right, the ability to assess what are the complaints and the concerns that are driving populist forces. And to the extent that those have merit, perhaps we ought to adapt our own policies, our own positions, our own rhetoric. You say that does happen in practice, okay, to some extent, maybe not as much. I share your sentiment. I think it's your sentiment that the academic elites, so to speak, in the economics profession have been slow to recognize the legitimate concerns and anxieties and economic hardship that some people have experienced, and why that leads them to become unhappy with the political system. I want to say more, but I already said a lot, so let me give you a chance to respond to that.
No, I think we're on the same page here. Let me say also, discussing about this issue is, I want to view it as a scholar, but at the same time, I'm a citizen, and I live in the UK, where it was a catastrophic decision of Brexit. I almost lived Grexit, which would have been another, huge outcome of populism. So it's also very sentimental for me.
Right.
So I need to make this caveat ex ante. But I think another good example, although I have studied a bit, but not to a great extent, is the Populist Party in the United States in 1996, where they almost defeated McKinley. And I understand they had an anti-immigration agenda, perhaps they were racist, but at the same time, the point that they made against cartels and against the big trusts, it was something that Teddy Roosevelt subsequently took on board. So what I think we want to stress is that you may disagree with a party. It doesn't have to be a populist party, but you can agree with that they are flagging, perhaps with a vulgar way, perhaps not in a way that you and I would have done it, some issue. And that's why I think we should not be super dismissive, especially now that I think, if I was to make a forecast, that populism is transforming. So if I was to see in Europe, you can clearly see that many parties that took power, because in the parliamentary system, through coalition, something that you do not have in the United States, or presidential system, actually you do see that. So now in Italy, you have an alliance of two populist parties, at least here I'm using the classifications of political parties. One party, Forza Italia, that was not typically classified as populist. I understand that some things that they're doing in the social agenda I would not have voted for, but clearly you see them evolving over time.
Mm-hmm.
I would say also that the AfD party has kind of evolved in the case of Germany, not necessarily for the better or for your tastes or mine, but I feel that populist leaders nowadays want to rule, and of course, when you start ruling, you have constraints. And I think it's fair to say, going also to the 70s now and the 60s, more of the Latin American vintage of populism, that the new populists have kind of learned the mistakes of the past. Okay, I understand that with Erdogan, we had almost hyperinflation, or the chaos in Venezuela still goes on. For example, Bolsonaro, we didn't see hyperinflation. Or more of, if one was to classify the current leader of Colombia as populist, if one was to do that, clearly we don't see hyperinflation there. So even the more left originating from in Latin America kind of political parties, clearly they have learned from the mistakes of the past. I think this is fair to say.
So just two somewhat disparate points. One, back to the U.S. I appreciate all the discussion of the European cases, but back to the U.S., it seems very natural to me to read the U.S. Constitution, partly it's the constitutional order, partly as a system that's designed to insulate political decision-making from transitory populist impulses. I mean, we have the separation of powers and checks and balances. We have a bicameral legislature. So all of these things kind of slow down the speed with which political impulses in the population at large get translated into policy. And I think that was a very conscious aspect of the design of the Constitution. I don't know if they talked about it in terms of populism per se, but that was part of the logic. And that's one example of how slowing down the process might actually be the process by which current political will as expressed in the electorate gets translated into policy changes. So
I fully agree. And let me say, this is nothing, even at the time of the establishment of the United States, this was nothing new. So this goes back to Aristotle or Plato. As a Greek, I want to think that everything goes back there.
Okay, well, you're entitled to play that card.
Thanks. But my point is that when we have the sprung of democracy and the gradual extension of the franchise, those were the core issues that were debated even at the time, of course, with the economic system of the time. So I just want to stress the point that you're making.
Yeah, the other observation I would make, it's a narrower one, but it's very much in the realm of economics. There's been an enormous push for central bank independence within the economics profession. It's had either some accidental or consequential success. I'm not sure why, but there is more central bank independence now. And it's related to and it's viewed at least within the economics profession as being partly responsible for the moderation of inflation since the 70s and early 80s. And the less frequent, we haven't eliminated high inflation episodes by any means, but you made the point that even in populist leaning regimes, the incidence of really bad inflation episodes has diminished. So there's learning there, as you suggested, but there's also been some institutional change that has probably facilitated that. And there's also been a change of views among, let's call it, back to the intellectual elite. Okay, this idea of central bank independence is not that old. So that is also really central bank independence, as economists think about it, is partly meant to insulate day-to-day monetary policy decisions from transitory political impulses, whether populist or otherwise.
True. I'm fully with you here. But I think it's fair to say, so one, I think, extreme version of an economist would be, oh, look, the reason why the president of Chile or the president of Colombia do not inflate is because they're central bank independent. I think it's part of the story as an economist. But I think also, although I was not alive in the 70s and the 60s, that still the people do not want inflation. Perhaps because they lived the hyperinflation. Also Latin America is relatively in the 80s, for example. So it's this, in some sense, the coevolution of beliefs coupled with institutions. And I think what is the danger of political populist parties and leaders today is that they take other institutions, at least at their focus, not so much central bank. I understand that central bank is also attacked recently by many populists across the world, actually. But you have also some other kind of institutions that, for example, safeguarding minority rights, that it doesn't matter, the skin of your color, which deity you believe in. And these are also core fundamental issues, and we see now an attack there. Attack on judges. So what was, to give one personal observation, I was stunned during the Brexit referendum and a bit after, with the attack that happened in this country, that it's globally praised for its judges and law, against the judges.
Can you flesh that out specifically? Which attacks? You're talking about in the U.S.? Or
No, I speak in the UK.
on the UK.
So in the United Kingdom, during Brexit, there was a very big attack on judges, actually shortly after Brexit, because the government at the time didn't want to pass a bill of parliament, an act of parliament, to initiate Brexit. And then judges, both at first instance and at the Supreme Court, ruled what you don't have to be a constitutional lawyer, that according to the constitution of this country, parliament is sovereign, and therefore to enact Brexit has to come from parliament. And then those judges were deemed in the front page of newspapers enemies of the people. There were attacks in their houses. They went after their kids. And this was in a country that is praised for the high quality judicial system. And to me, this also matters for business, matters for economics, not to say it matters for society.
Yes, but yes, just when exactly did these attacks take place?
So they took shortly after Brexit, after the Brexit referendum.
After the Brexit referendum. And so I want to make sure I understand this. So the judges were basically saying Parliament isn't doing its job?
No, the government wanted not to go to Parliament to enact a bill, because if you recall, the Tory party was kind of split. I mean, in the sense that some Tory members of the ruling party at the time were against the referendum. So the judges, the only thing they said is that, look, to enact the process of Brexit, it has to be a vote on Parliament. And just because they did their job, both in the first instance and on the Supreme Court, they were attacked.
Yes, okay.
And they were attacked as representing the interests, let's say, of Londoners who overwhelmingly voted against Brexit. Right. So it had this very strong anti-institutions, anti-elite kind of component.
Right, I see. Okay, thank you for explaining that. So let's look forward. You've studied this phenomenon much more than most, and you've got a broad outlook, that spans many countries on this topic, and you've written this review of the literature. So I think you're better positioned than most of us to speak to the outlook for populism as a political force going forward. So is it a largely spent force that's now going to dissipate? Is it here for a while? Is it going to intensify? How do you see populism as a political force playing out over the next 10 years or so, and in terms of its consequences for policymaking?
I want to make one remark before I go to your question, because when you asked me about what we know about the drivers, I mentioned economics, but there's also a second pillar, which is culture. But then culture, and if I was to pick as culture, anti-immigration kind of sentiment, just one component, this intersects with very distorted views between reality and what people perceive as the reality. So there is fascinating work by the late Alberto Alesina and Stephanie Stancheva, and Stephanie continues this kind of work. Both in the US and across the world, people have very distorted views, for example, about the share of immigrants in the United States, or the share of immigrants even in Sweden or in France. And then if you dig, there are even bigger misperception. For example, when Stephanie and Alberto were asking what's the percentage, let's say, of Muslim immigrants in the United States, or the percentage of the immigrants that are poor. And I want to stress this because looking forward, I think there are the following forces that I think are here to stay. Distorted views between reality and between reality and what people believe, and not only on immigration, on mobility, on taxation, on various kinds of issues. Second is the increasing role of social media, both to get news and also to amplify or magnify or shout those differences in perceptions. So I would say this is the second factor. A third factor which is here to stay is the tabulations in economics from our profession and others kind of show that an increasing share of Americans, of Europeans, feel lonely. They do not spend much time with their friends. In the old days, at least in Greece, we would go to the cafeterias and debate politics all the time. politics from the local mayor till what's happening in Cambodia and Chile. This time use data suggests that it's not happening anymore. So how can we think, I think you are posing a bigger question, which Sergey and I started thinking for a subsequent vintage of this review that you mentioned, is how can we think about politics in a world that is actually fundamentally different than the time when we thought about the median voter kind of paradigm. So I think you see one force that goes against populist parties. I think politicians have learned a mistake. For example, the 2 or 3, better mega stimulus bills in the US. In my humble opinion, politicians always thought, oh, perhaps we made a mistake in 2008. When I say mistake from a politician's viewpoint, not necessarily from an economics viewpoint, of not supporting people, let's try to support this time. Clearly in the European setting, when I discussed with European politicians, it was clearly part of their thinking. Let's avoid the mistake of the crisis in 2010. And actually, there are a couple of papers showing that austerity can magnify economic harm and push people to Brexit. There's a fantastic paper at the AR by Timo Fetcher showing exactly this. So I think on the one hand, I think politicians are trying to help, even in anticipation of being re-elected and trying to minimize the support of the populist party, or even in coordination with populist parties in Europe when they are coalition partners in government. But then populism, at least to me, the big danger comes from an aspect which I'm really, really worried, because we spend more and more time on social media. There are more and more segregation online, and we spend more and more online versus offline.
So we'll have to have another episode on some of the things there. You just covered a lot of ground in that in that set of remarks. And some of it I'm sympathetic to, some of it I'm more questioning of. I'm a big proponent of using surveys to elicit people's attitudes and so on, but I've been doing it for a decade. But I also know that it can be very tricky to do that. So I think in my mind, at least, the jury's a bit out as to exactly how distorted people's perceptions are, because it's quite challenging to actually extract from their minds what they actually believe, especially about things that they don't regularly articulate. So I'm a little more, the jury's yet out on some of that stuff, but we can't.
We do not disagree.
The time is there's not. We'll have to that'll be a topic for another day. Social media, yes, it's changed the way we communicate and interact for sure, and it's having profound consequences. So you kind of raised like a whole new set of issues right at the end,
which is great. You can invite more people.
We're going to have another conversation about those things. But let me just see if there's anything else you want to say about the topics we covered. That you brought in the cultural side of things at the end, which I think is great. Because I'd forgotten to nudge you about that earlier. Anything else you think we've left out of the broad space we've already covered that you really want to get on the table before we sign off for this conversation?
I just want to stress and pinpoint a super interesting work published at the American Economic Review by Funkes, Mularik, and Trebesh, where they studied many populist episodes. Again, we can question the exact definition of each episode, showing that when you have a populist leader elected, he or she does not seem to deliver neither on economic growth nor on inequality, which squares with the great narratives of Dornbusch and Edwards. These are like, I keep reading this very nice collection of essays. But look, I understand why, let's say, Elias cares more about growth and my father, Miltiades, cares more about inequality. And, I can vote more for the pro-growth person, he for the more pro-inequality. But the evidence suggests that what we have learned from Latin America with very different kind of populist leaders than today still is present today. So I see the danger of putting poison in the society, weakening institutions, and at the same time delivering neither on growth nor on inequality. So I just want to stress, because we have both a panoramic survey and more specific kind of case studies.
Well, okay. Does that mean that the surge in populism will be self-correcting? And here
this is what many people say.
Okay.
But I think what you and I are worried, and I think your central bank independence comment is spot on, is that we think that we come up with some institutions like the founding fathers of the United States. So I'm really worried when I see a populist leader, okay, let's change the constitution to have like a third term. Or let's change the constitution as in Poland to be able to appoint our exact judges and change how we view Jews and other kind of minorities. So to me, let's say it's fine, whatever, you inflate a bit more, you increase taxes, I lower taxes.
Okay.
I can see the point, but weakening institutions is core.
Yeah, I'm going to summarize in somewhat different words what I think you've made a really important point, which is it may well be that the political system has some self-correcting response to populist waves. Nonetheless, a lot of damage can be done in the meantime before the self-correction is in place, and maybe even more worrisome over the long term, that before the self-correction happens, institutions can be weakened in such a way that the society is persistently less able to function effectively, politically, economically, and more broadly. Is that a,
You
is
said
that a
it
fair
much
summary?
better than me.
Okay.
I will just add one word, Brexit, which is a massive change of institutions.
Yeah.
I understand that perhaps not everybody across the world fully understands, but the European Union is everything. It's regulation of products, of food, of drugs. It's not only finance or trade that we obsess in economics. Freedom of people to move around. A massive change in institutions that it will be here for decades.
All right. Okay, so thanks so much, Elias. That was a really stimulating conversation, and we did leave some loose ends that we'll perhaps pick up another time, but thanks so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you so much.